Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's members-only quarterly webinar on professional resilience. My name is Cherry Ung, the membership manager here at AGA. We will begin the webinar at 1, which is 1:01 right now. For now, let's just start quickly to make sure that you can hear me by playing a trivia game. I'm going to play a short clip of a classic 80s commercial just to test your sound, and if you can locate the question box, you can type in your answer. So let's start. Okay, can everybody type in the questions box what item or product do you think that they are trying to sell in that commercial? Great, thank you, Susan. You can hear me. Okay. Oh, you've never heard it? Oh, you couldn't hear. Okay, well, you couldn't hear the commercial. Okay, well, that was an 80s Doublemint gum commercial. Sorry you guys couldn't hear it. It was a really cool one. Okay, so let's get started. Let's begin. Again, welcome to today's webinar on professional resilience. This is an AGA members only webinar. You are eligible to receive 1 CPE for this webinar today. And how will you receive CPEs, you ask? Great question. Let me go to the next slide. Red letters in a red box will be placed randomly throughout the webinar presentation slide deck. Please make sure to write these letters down. The letters are affixed to the slides. Make sure that you will see that you can see the webinar presentation slides. This will be impossible to do if you are dialing in only using your phone. So the letters cannot be announced or displayed in the chat box. Doing so is against NASBA rules and policy. At the end of the webinar, you will be prompted to enter these letters via a survey box. For example, on this slide, the letter Z is on the upper right-hand corner in a red box. You would use this CPE tracking letter, and you need to write that down. If you have any questions during the webinar, please use the question and chat box in your control panel to ask any questions. I will be monitoring and answering, and Mark will be answering your questions throughout the webinar. And so, Mark, let's have you start and introduce.
Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Mark Rieger. I hope I know many of you. It's a great crowd today. For the next 50 minutes, or now about 45 minutes, we're going to try to get through some information, some observations that I've had over my 41-year career to provide you some help with your growth and development as you move through your career. So bear with us. Hopefully you'll have a good time for the next hour and get a little relaxation. If you have a soda in your lunch there, please partake. So we're going to move on to the next slide. I have been 20 years in the federal government, but I started my career actually coming out of Loyola College, working for Westinghouse Electric. And my first job as a professional accountant was to count radar units. So Westinghouse in those days used to make radar units for a certain Air Force fighter plane. And we had to make sure that our projections were perfect every month because these were expensive radar units and meant a lot to Westinghouse. So my first professional job was to make sure that I got it right, how many radar units we delivered each month. Incidentally, it was either one or none. And so in those days, those projections were either 100% right or 100% wrong. I mention this as an example going into the seminar because we're going to talk about a number of things about creativity, about collaboration, and about communications. And I learned very quickly in that first job that if I was going to be successful at Westinghouse, I needed to find the person on the production floor who signed off on that radar unit. It didn't work for Westinghouse very long because I got in trouble for talking to the labor employee supervisor down on the floor. But they acknowledged that my projections were the most accurate they had ever seen. And when I did leave Westinghouse of my own volition to take a job with the state of Maryland, Westinghouse actually offered to take me to Pittsburgh because I was clearly management material. All that from just thinking about a problem and finding a solution. So we're going to talk about that. Then I spent 20 years at the state of Maryland. I started my long career there with creating an internal audit function for the Maryland Department of Agriculture. They had never had an internal audit function before. It's always great to go somewhere where it's a new job because people's expectations are fairly low. So we set up the Maryland Department of Agriculture internal audit. On my second day at the Maryland Department of Agriculture, now just 6 months from graduation from college, I was assaulted by a group of federal auditors. It seemed something called the Single Audit Act had passed Congress, and the Department of Agriculture, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, had decided that they were going to do a test case. So they sent their auditors to the Maryland Department of Agriculture. Now, for those of you not in the DC area, the Maryland Department of Agriculture is about 30 miles across Route 50 from the United States Department of Agriculture. This was a very short, easy trip for them. We were not the cognitive agency for the state of Maryland. It was the Department of Transportation. So on my second day as the Director of Internal Audit, I was directed by OMB, who I called when the auditors showed up, and they told me that I should throw those auditors out of our building because they were not supposed to be there anymore. That was my first introduction to challenging the federal government, and it was successful. It was a very nice group of guys. They said that they had come out as a test case. They were sorry it was my second day of work there, but it was, again, a lesson of listen to what was going on and trying to find a creative solution. I left the state of Maryland with 19 years and 9 months service. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then went to work for DC government for about 22 days and the Baltimore County Public Schools for 6 months, and then went on to join the federal government. At the federal government, I worked as the CFO of the FCC, the CFO of OPM, an assistant secretary for accounting policy with Treasury, and then left my career after spending the last 3 years at OMB in the executive office of the president as the acting controller of the United States. So lots of fun jobs, folks, and a couple of lessons learned that we'll try to get through today. Just before we start, I wanted to make the point of be not afraid. You're going to hear some interesting stories that I think I went through, but we all have interesting stories in our career. And maybe the one lesson that's so important is if you go into a job with a positive attitude and you do the best you can, regardless of the outcome, the people who see you do the work, the people who help you do the work, the people who you work with are going to know what you can do and what your skill sets are, and they actually do come to your aid when you need it. So here we have examples of some things we're going to talk about in a little more detail today. Sorry, having a little trouble getting the slides to change, so we'll come back to that. If we could put up the first question. That's good. Now could you put the question up? There we go. So this question is really just to get you started to help you think about your total career. So how many of you have ever been fired? And by this I mean you've been fired from a professional job, not some job you had in high school, guys. you left the job under the threat of being fired, or you resigned to avoid illegal acts. So we're going to take a second and just let you vote on those. I'm hoping we'll all get to see the results in a minute. Okay, while we're waiting for that, I'm going to just keep talking, and we'll fill in with the results when you see those. The reason I asked this question.
Do you see the?
No, I can't. I don't know if they can, but I can.
Okay.
So the reason I asked this question is that I told you that my first professional job was Westinghouse, but then I moved on to the state of Maryland. I did spend 8 years, I think, in the Maryland Department of Agriculture as the internal auditor, as the CFO, and as the Deputy Director of Administration before a job opened up in the Maryland State Treasurer's Office. I moved over to the Treasurer's Office. This was a great job. I was the director of the office. It's a fairly small office in Maryland. It might have had 40 employees. It is run by an elected individual. The state treasurer is elected by the legislature, and the treasurer has a deputy, and I was the third person in line. I was the director of the office. It was a great job for a while. We changed treasurers 3 times while I was there. All were wonderful individuals, but it was the end of that that really started to be a challenge. So looking at the results, I see that you all do have strong ethics, because 41% of you did say that you had resigned to avoid doing illegal acts. So the treasurer's office story in Maryland was that I had the middle treasurer that I worked for was a lady from Montgomery County. She was a wonderful lady and great for the state. She unfortunately developed a brain tumor during her first term. And so while she was under treatment, she had asked me, and I had become her chief deputy treasurer, so the number 2 person for the state of Maryland in the treasurer's office. And when we came up to her re-election, she had had the treatment. She had been feeling better. So the legislature re-elected her as treasurer. Unfortunately, the tumor came back very quickly, and she had to resign from her office. The third treasurer I worked for was a gentleman who took her place after that. This gentleman had been in our legislature for a long time. Great guy, knowledgeable gentleman. But, when the second treasurer was out, I was the one doing testifying for her and all. Can we move on to the slides again? And the story goes that one time when I was actually testifying in the legislature in Maryland, I had said something that individual who would later become my boss wasn't really happy with. He had alternative views of how the pension portfolio in Maryland should be invested, and we were trying to follow a more stable environment. And so he literally took his shoe off and threw it across the room at me during a hearing, told me to shut up. So 6 months later, when he wound up being my boss, I knew that could be a challenge for my career. I'd been very successful as the chief deputy treasurer. We had won lots of accolades. We had actually made some videos with our friends in the U.S. Treasury, won some things, and it was a great time and a job I still treasure. Unfortunately, no, one too far. Unfortunately, what we wound up with was a few weeks into that term with the third treasurer, he came in my office one morning and said, "My advisors tell me that I can appoint somebody to your job, and so how fast can you leave?" 19 years, 9 months of public service, all but 2 of them being in career service jobs, and so I left by noon. Luckily, I had seen that coming, and I had put in a few applications. But the good part of the story, the reason that I'm bringing it up, is we're going to talk about collaboration in a minute. I left my office in Annapolis, went the 5 miles home, walked in the front door, and the phone was ringing. Now, I hadn't yet told my wife that I was unemployed. Hadn't told our 3 girls that Daddy no longer had a job. But I did. I went and picked up the phone, and it was a gentleman from DC government, Tom Hustis, who was then the treasurer of DC. Tom and I had been jointly recruiting people for DC government. And he said to me, I called your office a minute ago and they said that you no longer work there. I said, yes, that's true, Tom. The treasurer asked me to leave. He said, okay, I've talked to the mayor. He's agreed you can go on the payroll. And so for the next 22 days, I worked for DC. I had told Tom that I wasn't going to stay very long. And he asked me if I would come over and help him with some banking contracts in the meantime. And I was reeling from somebody asking me to leave. Now, the survey question asked how many had left when they were asked to do things that they didn't want to do. The third treasurer of Maryland never broke any laws, but he did have a different view of operations and a much different view of how we contracted with people. And I pretty much knew that I was going to leave, so I had also applied to a few federal agencies. So we'll come back to that. This slide that you see before you now is really the three things that I hope I've learned over those 41 years that I've now worked in federal service, federal state service, are creativity, collaboration, and communications. And we want to talk about all three of these for just a couple minutes. Can you change the slide? Thank you. So this is a quote by Harvey Firestone. It's about creativity. Of those three things, I think the creative nature of each of you is by far the most important thing you have and the most important thing you bring to any engagement, any job you have. It's really not about the technical things. You can hire people to do the technical things. It's about how do you think about things? How do you look at problems? How do you approach things? It's that creative spirit, that ability to analyze a problem, maybe how many radar units are delivered each month, to find the solutions behind that, and then occasionally break a few rules to go find out and accomplish what the real mission was, which was to actually accurately report the radar units. That's one example of the kind of creativity that I hope all of you bring to your job, that I encourage you to bring to your job, that ask you to think about things when you are presented with problems, but don't get caught in this is the way we've always done this. It may be the way you've always done it. It may be the best way to do it, but you need to stop and think through what the problem is, think about different ways of doing it, do a little research into it, and then move on. So we're going to attempt to move on here. Collaboration. The second attribute that I've over the years come to appreciate is the ability to work with others and how easy it is to be smarter, to be more creative, and to get more accomplished by making sure you're having discussions with other people, by involving other people in those thorny issues, to ensure that you're making the decision, you're in the position of authority and responsibility, but that you understand that you are not the smartest person in the room, and that to gain the knowledge that you need to be able to do things and get to the right solutions, you really have to depend on other creative people. You have to get back to those really helpful things that are doing this. Remember, under creativity, the slide talked about adversity, technical competence, never saying the word no to somebody who comes with you with a problem, and to engage in change, to try to make sure you're pretty current with what's going on. I would encourage you to think about collaboration as ways of accomplishing all three of those things. You know, then it's not just you who's out there learning things. It's not just your mindset and your knowledge and your examples of things that are making progress, that are in the ever-developing world. You're tapping into other individuals who have different experiences and different knowledge, and you're building consensus around things when you do that, because nobody's right all the time. There are occasionally going to be solutions that you adopt, and those solutions are going to be wrong or not the best opportunity. By involving others in that discussion, not only have you tried to broaden your horizon over the things that you're learning, but you've also engaged with others so that when it does go wrong, it's not just you standing there saying, well, this is the right way to do it. It's you saying, we got a team of people together, we researched the problem, we proceeded with the solution that seemed the best at the time, and if it didn't work, then you have to expect that joint minds working together will do the right thing. So we're going to move on to the third one for a second. I think. And that's communications. So the attribute that we want to talk about a little bit more on communications is listening. It's really important in your learning about communications to think about how you listen, but also how people listen to you. You can be the best person doing the greatest work, but if you're not communicating that effectively to people, then you're probably not having the effect that you can and developing things in a better way. So when you think about communication, start with, how do you like to learn? How do you like to listen to people? Do you like to read? Many people digest material much better in the written form. We have charts and graphs. Do you like to listen and learn through looking at detailed material or through graphs? Or do you like to actually listen to webinars? So another example, when I started my state career, I was asked to join an organization that's a large credit union in the United States. Not long into that, I went to a conference and made some comments. Remember, adversity is a positive thing occasionally. And they proceeded to ask me if I would come to the next conference of that same group and talk a little bit about the information that boards should receive. The whole discussion was, how do you communicate effectively? How does management create and communicate effectively with a board of directors who only show up once a month or so to actually judge things? Well, what I did was spent a long time working on graphs and charts. Just how do you measure the things that I, as a new director, wanted to hear from our own credit union? It was a huge success. So again, our three things. It's creativity. Most of the credit unions in those days used to get these long charts, long graphs, large books of written material from people. They then would have a meeting, and the CFO of the credit union would talk to people ad nauseum about what they thought things were. By reducing that printed material to a few graphs and charts, maybe where revenue was going, where expenses were going, how many people were working, what turnover was, those fundamental principles that you wanted to hear once a month to judge things, and then reduce the rest of the communication. So put the charts out before the meeting, come to the meeting, talk for a short time about that, and have the discussion be the rest of the meeting. We very much had an impact on not only our credit union, but on credit unions around the nation who started to adopt the philosophy. So again, another example of trying to understand what people are trying to do, learn how people like to learn, mold your communications to how they like to hear, not necessarily how you like to communicate. So that's our three goals. We have some more things to talk about, but I wanted to take a second. We have a second question here. Could we run the second question? Okay, I can't see the results, so whenever you guys want to. Let me talk a little bit about this. So we were talking about job changes and not to be worried about that. And you remember that I spent 19 years and 9 months with the state of Maryland before, in 4 hours, I parked that career and went somewhere else. When I did that, Tom Hustis, the treasurer of DC, actually saved my butt. He did that by offering me a job that he knew I wasn't going to take for long, but he knew that I had some knowledge of how to write banking contracts, and he needed the help. What I didn't talk to you about was the second job, the Baltimore County Public Schools. I to this day would say to anyone, state, local, or anyone looking for a job, that a school board is a great job for an accountant. They have lots of activity. It's a great creative environment, and they have a lot of fun. Teachers, as a rule, are great people to work with. So how did I wind up with a job with Baltimore County Public Schools? Well, about my third day working for DC government, I had a call. I had belonged to the local Finance Officers Association, and a gentleman who had seen me there, who I had talked to, who we had become friends, called me because this was right around Y2K, and he realized that their payroll system was not Y2K compliant. He was looking for somebody who was going to have to install a new payroll system, but also train all the whole teacher community in how to deal with that. He thought I had a skill set of talking to people. You'll have to judge that. And asked me to come over and be his deputy to help install the payroll system. So I did. It was a great job. I never quite got to stay that long, though. The school system required that you make a 5-year commitment. And at that point, I had applied to a number of federal agencies for jobs. So I said to the superintendent, I'll be glad to do this job. I would like to do this job. I'll sign your 5-year contract, but I'd like to write on the bottom here that there's a caveat that if I get offered a federal CFO job, that this contract would be null and void. And he laughed. He was a good guy. And he said to me, yeah, I don't think we have a problem with that one at all. And so we signed that contract. Unfortunately for them, it was exactly 6 months later that I had been talked to by 2 federal agencies and was offered 2 federal CFO jobs. My then boss, the guy who offered me the job, actually was on his first vacation. He'd gone on a cruise. And so it was important to make sure he came back from his cruise. So my new federal employer actually helped me delay my entrance point for a while so that he could come back from his cruise. Good. 84% of you recognize that you got a job lead from someone you know. It is really important in that collaboration and in the communications part to meet people. I did not know the guy who offered me the job very well before he did that. I did know Tom Custis over in DC, but not very well either. We had just worked on projects together. So in my time of need, which could have been pretty bad, 2 people who I had met casually, who I had been working on some things with, who knew how I liked to work and kind of more about my personality than I knew, found opportunities for me and brought them to me. So I encourage all of you to make sure that to get out, to get around, to meet people, to make sure you show people the kinds of things that you're capable of and who you are, and to work on things together. Okay, we want to go one more slide. Thank you. So what are the characteristics of personal resilience? I hope that you sort of pick out of the discussions of my employment history that I like to think that I'm a person who has some resilience. My wife says in that year where I got fired from the state of Maryland that I actually made more money than I did till I was a Fed. She said, you collected on your outstanding reserved leave, you cashed out certain information, left my pension system. I wound up collecting that when I was 60. But I had 3 jobs over that Christmas because my event occurred on October 15th. These are dates you don't forget. I was working officially in DC for 22 days over the Christmas, and Baltimore County in those days gave their kids 20 days off for the religious holidays around December and January. And so I got paid by my former employer, DC government, and the school system at the same time. So she was happy instead of being mad at me for having lost my job. But I want to talk about these characteristics of personal resilience a little bit. I think these are important things to focus on for you and for you to think about as you approach your job. Not just once, but do these things regularly. Sit down and just do the reflection. So your ability to concentrate and stay on topic. You know, you have things that you need to get done. I don't think any of you probably have one of those jobs where you're working on a single thing at a time. But you have to keep track of those things and make sure you focus on your own internal control. How do you think about things? How do you make sure that you follow up? How do you follow up on the commitments you made to people? On strong self-esteem, you have to realize that you're valuable people. If you're a government accountant, you are an incredibly valuable person. You've demonstrated an ability to master a technical skill of being accountant or knowing accounting. At the same time, you're charged with ensuring in your government that things are being accurately accounted for. This is both incredibly helpful information that people use to make everyday decisions and the check and balance on elected officials to make sure that they know that you, in your independent role as a government accountant, are going to report out on things. So have strong self-esteem, believe in yourself a little, understand that you have a very important role in government and in the function of the whole civilian activity. It's important for you to know how to do this stuff. Have personal goals. Have you sat down lately and actually written out your goals? I like to do an exercise that Ann Eberts did one time during a session. She actually gave us a piece of paper and an envelope. We sealed the envelope, addressed it, and sent it to ourselves. It didn't open that envelope for about 6 months. And I like to do that now. I don't send it to myself anymore. Postage is getting more expensive all the time. But I do write down some personal goals, put them in an envelope, and put that someplace where I know I'm going to find it in 6 months, maybe the wall calendar on a date back a little bit, and try to make sure that I'm actually accomplishing things. Sense of meaningfulness. Make sure you know what your role is. You know, when you take a job or get involved in something, what are you trying to accomplish? Not only for yourself, but what are you trying to make better for others? Every lesson is valuable. Don't forget that positives and negative lessons teach you. They teach you how to be a better person. They teach you how to recommend things, how to deal with people, how to learn, how to be creative. So take everything that happens to you and spend a little time with not reflecting too much, because any one event could put you in a hole, but just trying to know more about yourself and what you do. View stress as getting you stronger. What's the old adage is, if it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger. I think that really is a bit true. We have to accept that life is going to hand us stressful situations. And when we get through them, many times we don't stop for a second and say, you know, I did pretty good at that. It's important to stop and do that assessment. Think about humor, and I'm big into this optimism category. You can accomplish almost anything you can set your mind to. You certainly will never accomplish things that you don't set your mind to. One of the ideas of setting goals for yourself is you then thought about what you were trying to get done. You'll find that if you can commit those things to writing, more times than not, you won't have a problem actually accomplishing not necessarily all of them, but enough that you'll feel better about yourself. Use humor and patience. Understand that it's easy for you to know what you're talking about. It's harder for people listening to you to actually appreciate what you're thinking about and what you're trying to get done. Lastly, adopt the change. We're in a world that changes very, very regularly, and it's important for all of us to think about things that change and be ready to deal with change. We face change in everything we do with our homes, our activities, our electronic transactions, computers, webinars. It is a very changing world, and the pace of change is very rapid and growing more rapid. So don't let yourself get trapped into the situation where you're not planning, thinking, and trying to make sure you're keeping up with things. The last one on this chart that I'll talk about is action-oriented. When you make that list of things, make sure you use active verbs. It's very important when you set goals for yourself that there's things to do. It's not just be a better person. It's how you're going to be a better person. It's not just to learn more about something. It's to pick the thing that you want to learn more about and to write down maybe how you're going to get there. One of the big things we're going to talk about at PDT this year is cyber. Many of you probably have heard of cyber. Hopefully few of you have been through cyber instances, but if you have, you know that the best laid plans of mice and men sometimes go astray. We all like to think that we're immune from things like cyber attacks, but if you're an accountant and you're doing accounting work, you are responsible for financial transactional activities. So don't think about cyber as just an IT problem. It certainly is a problem that our friends and compadres in the IT world have to link with us and help us with. But the fundamental principles of being able to account for things, of issuing bills, recording receipts, generating the necessary reports to run your government entity fall to you. And so many of you have COOP plans. One of the things I've heard is it's really great to dust off that COOP plan and include in it a list of froms and tos. Where do you get the information that you need to do certain transactions? Who do you provide information to who is then required to do certain transactions? Think about your COOP plan as maybe it was a failure in the cyber attack of not just your system, but one of their systems, those feeder systems that you either take information from or give information to. So sit down with your COOP plan and redo it one more time. You probably want to do that periodically anyway, but the intent here is to do the tos and froms. Where do you get information? Where do you send information? Do you have contacts in those places so that you can make sure that those people are protecting their data that they're going to give to you, and that how they're going to use the data you give to them to protect it too. So this was about results oriented. So as you think about cyber, think about not just what would I do under a cyber attack, but think about a plan that you could do that would make it better from what you have right now to what it could be. If you don't know the things that maybe you could do for cyber, you certainly ought to tune into our AGA sessions during PDT this year, because there'll be a number of people giving you hints about things you could do. So results oriented, when you think of your goals, when you reassess your personal resilience, make sure you're thinking about action verbs, what things you're going to try to get done in your personal career and in your work career as well. So let's move on to the next slide. So this one I borrowed. It is not my slide, but I like it a lot. It's just attributes of people who try to maintain mental awakeness, about mental agility. There's a number of things on here that you should look through and think about yourself and how these things apply to you. I want to just point out a few of them to you. One of them is be productive. Video games are wonderful things, and I'm a fan of video games, but I'm not so sure that when we sit down to spend a lot of time with a video game, when we decide that we're going to be the master of a video game, that we've given any thought to how is that making anything better. You know, what we enjoy doing in our personal time should be relaxing, but it should also ever help you build mental awareness. It should help you learn new things and should make you a better person, a stronger person in both your personal life and in your career. So when you think about things that you want to do, think about things that are going to help you be a better rounded person and make you more attractive, not only to other people, but to yourself. That's going to make you more happy with what you're doing. Think about action-oriented verbs when you do that. When you think about things you're going to be productive at, see if you can straighten those out. Reflection. I think it's really important to stop and take time to think about yourself, where you are in your life and career, and what things you need to do to be better at it. We talked about my leaving the state of Maryland as one example. When the third treasurer came to work, as I said, I was pretty sure we weren't going to have this long-lasting relationship. If any of you who are feds, and probably the state and locals too, you know how long it takes to find a job, to apply for a job, and to go through the regular process when there are merit system principles being followed. I had applied for the several CFO jobs when I left the state of Maryland 6 months before I left. As soon as the new treasurer came in and I realized that this was not a great situation for me, I thought about, okay, I'm the deputy treasurer of a state. Where do I go from here? What's the next step that I'd be thinking of? Well, certainly a federal agency can be many times the size of the state, and their concepts and their operations are countrywide, not just limited to the state of Maryland where I was. And so it seemed like an opportunity for me. I happen to live in a town called Annapolis, which is about halfway between Baltimore and Washington, D.C. It was and remains a pretty long commute for when times I come back to D.C., but it wasn't undoable. The salaries were better in D.C. as a Fed, and so that looked like the logical place that I wanted to aim for my next job. I didn't have any anticipation. I was just aiming high and thinking with the skill set I had, I could do a resume, I could send in information, not misleading anybody, but seriously talking about things I knew and had done. Plus, when I was with Maryland, I had engaged with my federal counterparts. As I mentioned earlier, we were working on things like the Cash Management Improvement Act. We were actually working with the feds on creating the CFO Act at the time. And with the feds, we actually made some videos about proper accounting and proper reporting between the states and the federal government. So it was those kind of contacts that came up later when I was doing my federal applications. I could write that I had interfaced with federal agencies and the kinds of things we had done. Many times in my federal career, I had state and local people who, quite frankly, knew a lot more about some issues than feds ever did. It was great to tap into those people. They were interested in sharing their knowledge and expertise, and we were very interested in not only doing that, but meeting them. A number of those people over the years have decided that for their careers, they had topped out in the states or local jurisdictions where they were and have moved over to the federal government to help the federal government. That's a wonderful thing because the federal government needs people at a local level. All of you probably recognize the difference between the federal role, which is government-wide, the state role, which controls more state activities and things like education, commerce in the state, and the local roles where it's more like fire and police service. It doesn't mean, though, that at each level of government that you aren't better off knowing what the other level of government is. So state governments are a great incubator for new ideas and things to try. Federal government has resources which it can share to generate some of that incubation. And for the folks in the locals, you're the guys on the front line actually dealing with the people, the citizens that we all hope to affect the most. So it's important that you share data back between all three of you. So think about your role. If you're in a state and local, maybe you want to join one of the others in your next career move to either get closer to the people or to get further up in the policy level. And if you're a Fed, you really should try the state. It's really a cool place to work. Focus on helping others. In a number of these elements on mentally strong people, when you think about things in your own role, we talked about collaboration and how important it is that you talk and work with other people. I would encourage you to rarely give thoughts to making sure that you're standing out. I think you stand out best by engaging other people, getting them to, what's the old adage, do the things you want done best, but let them have the credit for being fantastic and for being creative and for getting the work done. People know who stands behind people, and they will help you do the right thing. So next slide. Question 3 when you get a chance. So this is sort of our end of this portion of the program. We're going to go into a little bit more right after this, but these are just the thoughts for today, which is celebrate every success. You're going to have positives and negatives, but when you have a success, when the group you lead has actually accomplished something more than you anticipated, when they've done their jobs and done them well, make sure you're celebrating those successes. Take the time to stop, thank yourself, thank your families for contributing, and thank your staffs for doing work. Learn from every failure. You can't be right all the time, and you're not going to be the best person you are if you aren't taking chances. So taking chances means that occasionally you're going to fail. You want to make sure that you think about the things that fail, learn from those, and move on. Life is a participatory sport. Play your best. We started with 3 questions or three segments of activities that I'm focused on, and they were creativeness, collaboration, and communications. What I'm going to do in the next couple minutes is just encourage you to engage with an organization called the Association of Government Accountants, who is sponsoring this webinar. AGA is a perfect opportunity for you to engage with others, for you to see and have experiences with new things, for you to be sharing information and gain from others sharing information across the spectrum of governmental accountants. For the feds in the room, it's very helpful for you to interact with the states and locals. For the states and locals, it's an unprecedented opportunity for you to talk to people who are doing your same activity at a federal level. They need to hear from you. You all need to make friendships, but more than that, you need to learn from each other.
Hi, Mark.
Accounting is changing. It's a very developing thing, and government is changing. Especially more recently, we have big changes in what governments do. We're all faced with resource constraints. We're trying to figure out how to provide services to citizens in new and creative ways at less cost. So here's the third polling question. How do you do to boost your professional creativity? You know, remember the number one thing we started talking about today was your ability to be creative. Do you participate in professional organizations for education? Do you focus on accepting projects at work which stress my knowledge? You know, don't say no. You might want to negotiate things that you are accepting, but you don't want to just decline. And always say yes to challenging assignments. You need to learn how to do new things. There needs to be that challenge in your future every time. Next slide. No, one the other way, sorry. Keep going. Oh, so I see the results. We'll just let everybody look at the results because we're running out of time and I want to make sure that we cover the last things. So if you move on to the next slide. There we go. So this is just, AGA is the member-oriented organization for accounting professionals. In our world, this is the organization that is out there. For states and locals and feds, it's really the only organization that brings all 3 together. You are all responsible for the activities of governments, and you're not really responsible for just your own activity. You have to know what's happening at the levels above and below. They're all important. Change the slide. So this is AGA's vision, mission, and core values. What I'd like to do is just encourage you in your organization to sit down and do your own vision, mission, and core values. And when you sit down and do that annual assessment or semi-annual assessment of your own activity, think about trying to write a vision, mission, and core values for yourself. What would you do? What did you think you'd like to see? What are you trying to accomplish in the role that you've accepted in the job you have? Or are you trying to accomplish something else? And maybe the job you have is not the place you need to be to do that. So you need to start to plan for how to move to that next job. Many of us, myself included, tend to stay in jobs too long. I would say at the end of my career, I learned a lesson, which is about every 3 years, I started thinking about where my next job was going to come from. By year 4, I sort of got focused on it. And not later than year 5, I took that new job. It doesn't mean you have to change employers. If you have to be lucky enough to be with the federal government, you can move entirely around the world and get different jobs. But regardless of where you are, you need to think about and plan for your own health, for your own personal development. And that would mean thinking beyond the job you're in, not just to what your boss does, but what would you like to do? Next slide. So the last couple slides here, which we'll just run through, are really about the demographics of AGA. Here you see 31% are federal government, 31% are state, 12% are local, and you can see the breakup and the makeup of individuals that you manage to talk to, interact with, and have things to do with when you attend an AGA seminar or when you're involved with AGA as a place to be. The next slide. So this is the research. When you sit down and start think about yourself and wonder what you want to do and think, okay, I know I have this job, but what's my passion? And incidentally, that passion is going to change many times in your career. You're going to want to sit down and think, how can I make this world a better place? What's my role in doing that? My role in doing that was many times to make sure that the accounting that I'm providing provides the best information for people who are going to make decisions, and that the citizens who can then access that information to see how public officials are dealing with those tax dollars that I'm pledging to them and providing are there. They can make their own decisions then about what their government, that they're electing representatives to represent them, is accomplishing with the dollars they have. I took that mission early on as something that was important to me, whether I was working in a school board, for DC government, or for the federal government. And that's kind of where I landed. After I've left the feds, I've engaged with AGA because I think the message needs to be carried to all of you. The message being that you're important, you do very important work for all of us. It's really helpful, but we want to make sure that you are the best you can be, and you will accomplish more and you'll be more successful when you're happy. Kia, I'm hoping you have some questions from people.
As of right now, we have a few people asking questions about sharing their ideas with you. One question is there a max amount of time in years that you would recommend that someone would be in a job before it becomes determined in their career, they will be less attractive to employers because of how long you stayed in the position doing the same thing?
Yes, I would say there is. Much to my chagrin, one of the things I've learned over the years is around that 5-year period, you really have demonstrated all the clear ideas you've had. You may have been a creative person, but you've managed to get done the things you want to get done. It's a good time to think about a different job. Not necessarily a different career, but make sure you found yourself a different job at that point, something that interests you and where you have fresh ideas and feel enthusiastic about it. Does an employer look at that? I think an employer wants to make sure that you have the oomph to be out there, that you have the personal ability to look at yourself and value your own skill sets and knowledge. And so they're looking for you too to be out there and be creative and looking for a job. So yeah, I would say when you've been doing a job for 3 years, take a look at what you've accomplished and decide if you haven't gotten something done, you only got 2 years to get it done. And by the time you're at 5, pick someplace else or something else to do in that employer that is different enough that you're not trying to do the same problems.
We have another question from Barbara. How do we navigate around managers in name only? There are folks who do not like change, are not open to new ideas, other ways of doing things.
So I think that's right. All of us in our careers can get in that grind of not being creative, not be accepting new ideas. Sometimes it's good to think about those ideas. Sometimes it's really good to sit down and think about that person. You know, look at the things they're doing. You'll find that many of them are doing some things, so you have to assess a little bit how they like to have things presented, you know, and tailor what you're presenting to them to the best way to approach them. Many bosses have predisposed ideas about things. They're comfortable too. They want to only hear new ideas that are going to enhance their own appearance to their boss. So, it's sort of important to assess the person you're presenting to and realize how they're going to want to listen to you. If you've done that and you haven't gotten to where you want to be, time to think about someplace else.
We have somebody who just wanted to share something that I'll read out. I actually got fired for finding an embezzlement by managing partner of a CPA firm where I worked at that time. He took the fact that I turned him in personally and fired me. Later, he went to jail and later became the president of an organization that I will not name.
So I think we all may have some experiences where we ran across people who weren't doing the right thing. I absolutely applaud you for turning them in and for making the point, and it sounds like you went and did it to the right people and they took whatever the appropriate action was. I would be proud to have accomplished that and know that you did the right thing. Do you pay for that? Well, maybe that's just the cost of occasionally being right or being truthful and honest. I would say that there are people out there who know that you did it and know that you did it for the right reasons. And so when you do decide to start looking around, I think you'll find that those people are aware of what things that you accomplished, and they'll be looking for that honest person to do the next job. Don't give up.
So I have a few more questions. We're not going to get through all of them, so I'll just forward these questions on to Mark to answer outside of this. But here's the last question. Any words of advice for someone who left a role too soon?
Yeah, that's a really hard one because you can think you're in the bad place and kind of walked out. Yeah, I would say either get more education or find a job that will let you decide if you want to go back to the organization that you now miss so much at a different level. It's pretty much you can't ever go back to that same job again, but you can go back to that organization. If the organization is a great organization and you think you can want to go back there because you like it, then you have to redress yourself in a different cloak. You have to figure out how you will now be attractive to that organization in sort of a different role. We all ever move forward. It's some jobs we all like. I very much enjoyed being the Chief Deputy Treasurer of the state of Maryland. I made lots of friends. It was a great job. But I have to tell you, my time as Deputy Controller and Acting Controller of the federal government was a lot of fun too. A stressful job, but a lot of fun. I would never encourage anybody to take something that made them truly comfortable. I think you've always got to be a little uncomfortable. That keeps you fresh. So rebucket yourself. Go get some additional education. Sign up for some AGA courses. If you're not a CGFM, get your CGFM and go back to that organization and say, I've made myself better. I'd like to try this. I like the company, but I want to come in a different role.
So those are the
I just want to thank everybody for today. This is interesting. I'm sitting in a very small conference room doing webinar. I like better when we have a big crowd and we can all interact together. Please come to PDT if you can. We'll be there and be glad to sit down and talk to any of you. Thanks again for calling in. And never give up on yourselves. You are the most important element of government. That accountability factor is critical. So have a good day, folks.
Thank you so much, Mark, for the insightful and engaging presentation. From all of the comments that we are receiving, everybody definitely enjoyed that. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today and for actively participating. We got a lot of questions, and as I said, Mark will answer these questions separately after the webinar. Just a reminder, registration is now open for next September 4th Diversity and Inclusion webinar. We hope you can all join us again and register. One last important point, reminder to activate the CPE survey. You will have to close your browser to activate the pop-up box where you will input the letters that you saw throughout the presentation. An email will be sent within 5 business days stating your certificate is ready to download. That concludes our presentation. Have a great rest of your week, everybody.